First of all, what went through my mind is how stupid am I to actually volunteer for this.
I'm really mind-blown.
This is what we came here for!
Spoiler alert! In this video we will be talking about the story found in the various books and chapters of the Roblox Minitoon Piggy Game. Chapter 1. The player is a police officer going to investigate the disappearance of George Piggy. They drive to the house where he was last seen. Upon leaving the car, the player hears a weird noise and gets hit in the head. They then wake up in the house and has to escape. Upon doing so they drive back to the police station to report what happened. Chapter 2. After escaping the house, the player goes back to the station for backup. As soon as they get there, an announcement is announced by Doggy warning the player of another monster. We know it's Doggy because of his signature purple font. After solving the puzzles, the player then enters the garage and escapes with Doggy. Chapter 3. After running out of gas, the player and Doggy become surrounded by monsters similar to Piggy. So then the player decides that they're going to have to escape through the gallery. Doggy seems to remember them. Then, one of the Piggy monsters manage to get into the gallery. When the player escapes, Doggy and the player go to the nearest forest. Chapter 4. 4 weeks after the previous events, the player and Doggy are at a campsite. No monster is nearby until they go to sleep. When they wake up, Doggy has been told to drink a monster potion by the monsters, so he drinks it and turns into a monster. After escaping, the player finds an old radio, and someone is on the other side asking if anyone is out there. It is later confirmed through Chapter 5 that it is Mr. P. Chapter 5. The player finds out the radio man is called Mr. P. He asks for the player's help to rescue his friend Bunny. The player finds out that the teacher is there as well, so the player manages to help Bunny and heads to the sewers. The player meets Mr. P and suddenly starts to get dizzy. The player faints, so Bunny takes them to a hospital to heal. Chapter 6. After waking up, Bunny informs the player that Mr. P is waiting on the roof and that the hospital isn't safe anymore, because Barry, the doctor, had become infected. The player must escape once more. Around the hospital, there are notes about an experiment involving the majority of a family. It is questioned whether or not the family was the pigs, and if it was, which family member wasn't there. Through Chapter 7, we are led to believe that Mr. P botched the mission and created the virus. After escaping, the player and Bunny find out Mr. P left without them. They then have to find another way out. As the player turns to leave, Bunny stays where she is. The player asks if she is coming and she replies yes, but she is distracted by a note left by Mr. P saying that it is for their good. Chapter 7. The player and Bunny are almost out of the city. All the player needs to do is unlock the train to escape. However, Bunny tells the player that she needs to rest. The player needs to get out. After the player unlocks and gets on the train, Bunny tells the player that Mr. P gave her a potion and she would become a monster. The player insists for her to get on, but she refuses, fearing that the potion will consume her soon. She tells the player that she will stay and try to hold off Zombie Piggy for as long as she can. Then the player leaves without her. Also just an observation, but when the final scene is playing once the player has escaped, Bunny's theme can be heard in the background. The same theme is heard as her piggy skin. Chapter 8. The player arrives at the carnival, hoping to get revenge on Mr. P. After the player unlocks the exit, the player talks but gets cut off because Pony and Zizzy are seen there. Pony thought the player was infected and asked Zizzy. Zizzy tells Pony the infected can't talk. The player introduces themselves and asks them what are they doing here. Zizzy replied that they were looking for survivors, and she has a safe place. Then Pony sees Foxy behind and thinks he is a friend. Then Zizzy tells Pony he is infected, so he hits Foxy's head with his wooden sword. Then they take the player with them to a place they call a safe place. Chapter 9. The player arrives on a rooftop. Pony says that he sees a safe place. It's confirmed by Zizzy there are other people inside of the building. The player, Pony, and Zizzy need to find a way in. Once getting past the gate, Zizzy asks what the player were doing before all this. The player confirms that they were a police officer. Pony was trying to become an optometrist like his father, and Zizzy was a fencing coach. Zizzy has sister, she also taught fencing. It's confirmed that her sisters are in a safe place too. Zizzy asks how the player ended up in the carnival, and they tell her that they were looking for Mr. P to stop him because he has been giving out potions that turn people into the infected. Zizzy tells the player to stay at the safe place for a while. From the trash bin, they all hear noises. Assuming someone is watching them, Zizzy and the player check it out. Pony stays behind saying, "Stay safe." Chapter 10. The person in the trash can is not seen by the camera. The person runs into the mall to hide. The player questions why the person would hide in the mall. The player then walks in. After getting past the locked door on the second floor, Zizzy tells the person who ran from the trash can to show themselves. George Piggy pops out behind a counter with an afraid look on his face. He is wielding a bat as a weapon in case someone tries to attack him. He asks how the player knows who he is. The player tells him their name. The player also lets him know he was the person they were looking for when going to the house. He says after his family visited the hospital, they acted all strange and scary. He went to the city to find grandma, but everyone looked scary, so he hid in the trash can. Zizzy tells him to come with her and the player. George asks if he can see his family again, and the player tells him that they will find the person behind all this. The player goes to the safe place, and one of the people say that Zizzy is back with friends. One of them says the player looks pretty funny, and Pony says that they tracked a helicopter signal nearby. The player suspects that it is Mr. P and that the player wants to see him. Pony says he and Zizzy will come with the player to find Mr. P. Zizzy says that she will be back soon and to take care of George Piggy. Zizzy, Pony, and the player head out to go find Mr. P and to stop him. Chapter 11. The player arrives at the outpost where the signal came from. The player needs to get access to a base. Once the player unlocks the base's door, George Piggy runs up to Pony, Zizzy, and the player. He says he tricked the two sisters into playing hide and seek so he could come and find out who hurt his family. Behind him is an abundance of monsters, so George and the player head inside while Pony and Zizzy defend. Once inside, the player can see Mr. P is missing some of his skin, which is replaced with mechanized parts, and says he tried to help make things better but made them worse. He doesn't notice that the player is there until they say they are going to stop him. He thinks his mind is playing tricks on him because he believes that George and the player are dead. He thinks the two people he let down are haunting him now. He runs away, so George and the player chase after him. Distorted memory. George has a memory while sleeping. He wakes up after a nightmare to find out that Penny is gone. He soon finds out that the house has changed into a nightmare itself, and now he has to find a way to escape. After he gets out of the house to find Penny, Penny runs away from him. George then turns into one of the infected. He wakes up in the mall after the dream. Chapter 12. After entering the plant, Mr. P is still insane and is trying to kill the player. After showing him a picture of his wife, he regains his sanity and reveals he abandoned Bunny and the player in the hospital with researchers because he thought the player were infected. Those researchers gave him the cyborg parts. George gets angry at Mr. P for taking his family away from him and wants to attack Mr. P, but the player stops him, reminding him that if he attacks Mr. P, he will become the one thing he hates the most. Mr. P offers to stay in the plant and fight off the infected. What comes after is chosen by the player. In the good ending, the player leaves the plant with George to find out Zizzy and Pony successfully fought off the infected. George suggests working on a cure. In a post-credits scene, Mr. P's hat is left inside the plant, with his location and fate unknown. In the bad ending, the player tries and convince Mr. P to come with them. Sadly, the player weren't paying attention and an infected badgie sneaks up on them and attacks the player. In a post-credits scene, Mr. P's hat is left inside the plant, with his location and fate unknown. In the true ending, the player tries to convince Mr. P to come with them. Instead of dying like in the bad ending, Mr. P tells his story to the player. The player then leaves with George, which is then the same as the good ending. In a post-credits scene, Mr. P's hat is not present inside the plant, with his location and fate unknown. Then in Book 2, Chapter 1. This is a flashback of when the player and Doggy arrested two burglars, Willow and Rash. Willow states that she only stole to provide for her family, but the player is forced to arrest her. Doggy and the player feel empathy for Willow, but there is nothing to be done now. Meanwhile, the player is brought back to the real world, where Mimi suggests that the player got batteries to get a radio working, so that other survivors may be contacted. Pony and Zizzy agree, so the player heads with them to the store to get some. Chapter 2. Batteries are needed for the radio, so Zizzy, Pony, and the player all look for some in the store. The player eventually finds the batteries they were looking for, and they use the radio. Mimi contacts the radio picks up, with the Settlement 6 asking the player to meet up with them. Pony is unsure at first, but the player agrees to meet up, and the three of them head to the location of it. The player doesn't find anyone at first, but then a group of bandits appear, with Willow as their leader. Willow addresses Pony and the player first, as she has history with them. Pony was an ex-member of their group before he left. Then she talks to Zizzy, who reveals that Pony had already told her all about the group. Willow decides to take away Zizzy for questioning. We decide to go after the group, who are called the Silver Paw, and save Zizzy. Chapter 3. Pony and the player stumble upon Settlement 6, the Lucella oil refinery, which Pony is oddly not familiar with, despite being an ex-member. They decide to enter, certain that Zizzy is inside. Once the player opens a specific enclosed room, Zizzy is found inside, brawling with an infected Polly. Zizzy states that she has fought so many that she is starting to enjoy it, and once Pony and the player ask her to leave with them, she feels as if she has pulled a muscle in her arm. As she lifts it, she reveals that one of the infected must have scratched her, and begs the player and Pony to leave without her, promising that she'll fend off as much as possible before she turns. The duo return to the safe place silently, and the rest of the survivors share the mutual silence, understanding that Zizzy is no longer with them. Chapter 4. Georgie wakes the player from their room in the safe place upon hearing a loud explosion. Neither are aware of the source, but both know that they should escape. Another bang is heard, and the player unlocks different rooms around the building, freeing Pony, Mimi, and Giraffe in the process. Pony finds that Z and Susie are not present, assuming and hoping that they have used the vent to escape safely. Following the survivors' escape, the Silver Paw, Willow and all of Settlement 6, bar Tigre, are outside, and capture every survivor, bar Z and Susie, locking them up. Once captured, Giraffe and Mimi apologize to Pony for meeting up with TSP in the first place. Well, that's all we have for now. Subscribe so you can check back with us for updates and more spoilers. Thanks for watching.
I'm Roby Mindblock.
Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't